She told me to take my medication and leave. Not in those words, exactly. My daughter-in-law, Claire, is smarter than that. She smiled when she said it, that tight little smile she saves for moments when she wants to remind me of my place. She said, "Walter, I think it's best if you find somewhere more comfortable for yourself, somewhere that works better for your situation." She glanced at my hands when she said it. I have a tremor now. Not bad, not yet, but enough that she noticed. Enough that she decided it made me a liability. My son Daniel was standing 6 feet behind her with his arms crossed, looking at the kitchen tile like it owed him an apology. He didn't say a word. That was a Sunday in October. The leaves outside their window, my window, though they'd long since stopped thinking of it that way, were the color of old copper, and I remember thinking it was one of the most beautiful days I'd seen in years. I stood there, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I listened to my daughter-in-law explain, in that careful, measured tone of hers, that their household was under a lot of stress, and that my presence was complicating things. She used the word complicating. I nodded. I set the cup down on the counter. I said, "Okay, Claire, give me a couple of days to pack some things." She said she'd appreciate that. What neither of them knew, what no one in that house knew, was that I had been waiting for exactly this moment for almost 8 months. I had hoped it wouldn't come. I had genuinely, sincerely hoped that my son was a better man than I feared he was becoming. But I had prepared, just in case, because that is what I have always done. I prepare. Let me back up. My name is Walter Gaines. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years building a commercial real estate management company out of nothing, out of a single duplex I bought with money I'd saved from 6 years of working construction after my first wife, Daniel's mother, got sick and the hospital bills nearly took everything we had. I learned the business the hard way, which means I learned it completely. By the time Daniel was in high school, I owned 14 properties across central Tennessee. By the time he graduated college, it was 38. I never talked about the numbers much. It wasn't how I was raised. You work, you build, you don't make a show of it. When Daniel was 26, I brought him into the company. He had a business degree and good instincts, and for a while, I was proud of what I saw in him. He had his mother's directness, her ability to read a room. We made a good team. Then he married Claire. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me, even when it's inconvenient. Claire is not a bad person. She is an ambitious person, which is a different thing. She grew up in a family that measured success by visible markers, the right neighborhood, the right car, the right address. She looked at the life Daniel and I had built and she saw potential, but she also saw things she wanted to change. She wanted a bigger house. She wanted Daniel to have a title that sounded more important than it was. She wanted me to stop being so present. About 2 years after the wedding, Daniel came to me with a proposal. He wanted to restructure the company. He had a consultant's report, something Claire had apparently commissioned without my knowledge, that recommended Daniel take on the CEO role formally, and that I transition to a senior advisory position. He presented it the way you might present a gift, like he was doing me a favor. I listened to the whole thing. I asked 3 questions about the legal structure. Then I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 4 months. During that time, I had several quiet conversations with my attorney, a woman named Phyllis, who has worked with me for 19 years and who I trust more than almost anyone alive. I also had conversations with my accountant, a man named Roy, who has the personality of a filing cabinet but the instincts of a bloodhound. Together, the 3 of us restructured things, not the way Daniel proposed, our way. What that meant, in practical terms, was this. I transferred the majority of operational control to Daniel, exactly as he asked. His name went on the letterhead. His title became CEO. He got the office on the corner with the glass wall. He started attending the Chamber of Commerce dinners and the Nashville business conferences and getting his picture in the local business publications. He loved it. Claire loved it more. What Daniel didn't fully understand, what he had never bothered to sit down with a lawyer and confirm, because he trusted me the way children trust parents, and because he had grown accustomed to things being handled for him, was the underlying ownership structure. I retained controlling interest in the parent company. Every property, every contract, every revenue stream still flowed through an entity that I controlled. Daniel was the CEO of a company he did not own. He had authority but not power. The distinction sounds small. It isn't. I didn't do this to trap him. I did it because Phyllis advised it, and because something in my gut told me to wait, to watch, to see who my son was going to become. Now that someone was whispering in his ear that he deserved more than he had. The next 18 months told me everything I needed to know. There were small things first. He stopped asking my opinion on decisions. Fine. He was the CEO. Then he started overriding my recommendations without telling me. Still manageable. Then he hired 3 people, Claire's brother being one of them, without consulting me or running it through our standard process. That was when Roy started flagging things for me. Then one afternoon I found out, through Roy, and not through Daniel, that he had been in preliminary talks with a regional investment group about bringing in outside capital, diluting ownership. My ownership, specifically. I called him that evening. He said it was exploratory. He said I was being paranoid. He said, and this is the part I still think about, Dad. You need to trust me the way I've always trusted you. I didn't say anything to that. I just said goodnight. That was February. By April, I had moved into the guest room of his house, their house, though my name was still on the deed, because I had sold my condo downtown and was supposedly figuring out the next chapter, which was true, just not in the way anyone thought. Living there gave me information. It also gave me proximity to my grandson, Tyler, who is 8 years old and who is the best thing in my world, which is why I stayed as long as I did and why, even now, every decision I made was made with one eye on what it would mean for him. Living in their house, I watched my son become a stranger. Not dramatically, not all at once, in the small accumulations of disrespect that are somehow worse than the big ones. He stopped including me in conversations about the business. He started sighing when I walked into rooms. He let Claire make jokes at dinners, gentle ones, calibrated to be deniable about my memory, my pace, my hands. I would sit at the head of the table, because that is where I had always sat, and I would feel the room arranged against me, and I would eat my meal and think about Phyllis and Roy and the paperwork that was quietly, methodically being put in order. I want you to understand something. I am not a man who enjoys conflict. I am not someone who was sitting in that guest room rubbing my hands together. There were nights when I lay there, and I thought about my first wife, Daniel's mother, and I thought about the boy he used to be, and I genuinely grieved the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. I gave him room. I gave him chances. There was a Sunday in June when I asked him if we could have breakfast, just the 2 of us, and talk. He said sure. Then he spent the whole meal on his phone. When I tried to start a real conversation, he said, Dad, I've got a lot going on right now. Can we do this another time? We never did. October came. That beautiful Sunday. Claire's speech. Daniel's silence. I packed 2 bags. I kissed Tyler on the top of his head and told him I'd see him soon and that I loved him. He asked if I was going on a trip. I said something like that. He said, Will you bring me back something? I said I would bring him back something good. I drove to the Residence Inn on West End because I had reserved a room there 3 weeks earlier when I started to sense this conversation was coming. I ordered room service. I called Phyllis. I said, It's time. She said, I know. Roy and I have been ready. I said, Make sure everything goes clean. Make sure there's nothing that can be called vindictive. She said, Walter, when have I ever done anything that wasn't clean? I slept better that night than I had in 4 months. Here is what happened in the following 6 weeks. First, the lease. The house Daniel and Claire lived in, the house they had decorated and renovated, and in which Claire had hosted her book club and her dinner parties, was a property I owned outright. I had never charged them rent, not $1. The understanding, which was verbal and therefore, as Phyllis had explained to me years ago, entirely at my discretion, was that they were guests in the house. When I moved out, that understanding changed. Phyllis sent a formal notice of lease commencement. Market rate for a house in that neighborhood and of that size was $4,200 a month. That was the number on the document. Daniel called me within an hour of receiving it. He was not calm. He said, "What is this?" I said it was a lease agreement. He said, "Dad, you're not serious." I said, "I'm always serious about paperwork, Daniel. You know that." He said Claire was furious. I said I understood. He said, "You can't just do this." I said, "I think you'll find that I can." He said some other things. I let him say them. Then I said, "Daniel, I want you to call Phyllis and ask her to walk you through the ownership documents on the house. Take your time with them. Call me back when you've done that." He called back 3 hours later. His voice was different, quieter. He said, "I didn't know it was still in your name." I said, "There are quite a few things in my name that you may want to familiarize yourself with." Second, the company. I had a meeting scheduled with the investment group that Daniel had been courting, the one he hadn't told me about. Roy had arranged it quietly. When I walked into that conference room, the look on the lead partner's face told me that Daniel had not mentioned I would be there. I sat down. I introduced myself as the controlling interest holder of the parent entity. I slid a document across the table. I said, "Before we go any further, I think it's important that everyone understands the ownership structure." The lead partner read for about 45 seconds. Then he looked up at Daniel, then back at me. He said, "Mr. Gaines, I was under the impression that." I said, "Yes, I know what impression you were operating under. I'm here to correct it." The meeting ended shortly after that. The investment deal, as structured, was dead. Daniel could not bring in outside capital without my signature. He could not dilute my interest. He could not, it turned out, do much of anything at the level he'd been operating without me. He came to the residence inn that evening. I had expected him to be angry. Instead, he looked something closer to scared. He sat down across from me, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you had this set up?" I said, "Since the spring." He said, "Were you waiting for me to mess up?" I said, "I was waiting to see if you would." He was quiet. Then he said, "That's not the same thing." I said, "No, it isn't." There was a silence. He looked at his hands, and then out the window at the parking lot. He said, "Claire said you were losing it, that you couldn't keep up anymore, that it would be better for you if you—" He stopped. He seemed to hear the words differently now that he was saying them out loud, in that context, in that room. I said, "I know what Claire said. I also know what you chose to do when she said it." He didn't have an answer for that. Third, Claire's brother. Marcus had been brought in as Director of Business Development. He had a salary that Roy described to me as aggressive given his experience level, which from Roy was practically a profanity. Marcus had also, in the 7 months he'd been with the company, managed to lose 2 clients, approve a vendor contract with terms that cost us about $40,000, and expense a company credit card for things that had nothing to do with business development. Roy had documented all of it. I sent the documentation to Daniel with a note that said simply, "Please review and advise on your intended course of action." I didn't tell him what to do. I didn't have to. Marcus was gone by the end of the month. I heard Claire's reaction to that secondhand, through Daniel, which is to say I heard a summary of it that was probably significantly toned down. The gist was that she felt I was dismantling her family. I thought about that framing for a while. Dismantling. As if what I was doing was destruction, and not correction. What I was actually doing was making sure that the company I had spent 30 years building didn't get hollowed out by people who saw it as an inheritance rather than a responsibility. There is a difference. Now I want to tell you about the night things changed. Not the business things, not the legal things, those I had controlled from the beginning. I mean the thing between me and my son that had been broken since February and maybe longer, if I was honest with myself. It was a Wednesday evening, in late November. I had come by the house to pick up Tyler for his baseball practice. I had been doing that every week since I moved out, because Tyler was not part of any of this, and never would be if I had anything to say about it. I knocked on the door. Daniel answered. Claire was not home. He looked like he hadn't slept well in some time. He looked, to tell you the truth, like I had looked the morning after his mother's funeral, which was a specific kind of exhausted that goes past the body into something else. He said, "Tyler's in the back. Come in for a minute." I came in. The kitchen was a little cluttered. The house felt different without Claire's careful arrangement of it. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking me if I wanted one, which he hadn't done in years. He set mine down across from his at the kitchen table and he sat down. I sat down too. Tyler was outside with the dog. We could see him through the window. Daniel said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Tell me what you think you're apologizing for." He looked at me. He said, "That's a harder question than it sounds." I said, "Yes, it is." He took a long time with it. He talked about Claire, and then stopped and corrected himself and talked about his own choices instead, which told me something. He talked about what it had felt like to finally have his name on the door and how he had let that become more important than it should have been. He said he had known, on some level, that the way things were going was wrong and that he had chosen not to examine it too closely because examining it would have required him to do something about it, and doing something about it would have meant a confrontation with his wife that he didn't want to have. He said, "I let her push you out. I know that." I said, "You did." He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I sat with that for a moment. Outside, Tyler threw a ball, and the dog scrambled after it, and Tyler laughed that full, uncomplicated laugh that 8-year-olds have before they learn to be careful with their happiness. I said, "I know you are." I said, "An apology is a beginning, Daniel. It is not a resolution. There is work to do. Real work. Not just between you and me, but in here." I pointed at my chest. "You need to understand why you made the choices you made. Not just that they were wrong, because the same pressures are going to come again in different shapes. And if you don't know what moved you this time, something else will move you next time." He nodded. He looked young in that moment. Not weak young, like the boy who used to sit across from me at another kitchen table in another house and ask me about the properties, about the tenants, about the work. I said, "I'm not going anywhere. I want you to understand that. This company is as much about you as it is about me. It was always meant to be yours. But it has to be earned, Daniel. Not just handed over because someone convinced you that you were ready before you were." He said, "Were you testing me?" I said, "No. I was watching you. There is a difference between a test and an observation. A test has a predetermined outcome you're working toward. An observation is open. I was hoping to be wrong about what I saw." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What happens now?" I said, "Now we have a real conversation. About the business, about the structure, about what you actually want versus what Claire wants, about what kind of man you intend to be. And then we start building that. Together, if you want." He said, "I want." I said, "Then finish your coffee. We've got a lot of ground to cover." Tyler came in from the backyard a few minutes later with mud on his shoes and the dog behind him and a request for hot chocolate. I made it for him while Daniel dealt with the dog, and the 3 of us sat at that kitchen table for another half hour. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt like somewhere I was wanted to be. There is an ending to tell you about, because there are always practical matters. The lease. Daniel and Claire are paying it. I used the first 3 months of payments to start a trust in Tyler's name, his education, a foundation to start from, something that will be there regardless of what happens between any of the adults in his life. That was always the plan. He will not be caught flat-footed the way I nearly was at his age. He will not have to choose between his future and someone else's mistake. I made certain of it. The investment deal. I had a follow